David Cooley and Jessica Fern, welcome to the Personal Success Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan.
So Jessica, who is Jessica Fern and what is your mission?
Yeah, well, I'm a therapist, an integrative therapist and counselor, and an author. And yeah, my mission is really about helping people to evolve past their own limitations that are within or interpersonally with their relationships. So really supporting the evolution of consciousness through healing work, through healing trauma.
Wow, you said something very key there, which is, I'm in the coaching world and I do a lot of these, just what is your mission type things. And my mission, at least part of my mission statement, is sort of like helping the evolution of consciousness. And so that stuck out for me, Jessica. That's awesome. And so I guess, David, I just want to let you, how did you become involved in this mission, and how does your mission relate to Jessica?
Yeah, well, I think we both share that same passion and intention to use our vital energy, our creative energy in this life as a medium through which we can help people and ourselves, right? Raise our level of consciousness. And I think the thing that I've arrived at after a very twisted and confusing path over the years have realized that I think the medium through which, or one of the most powerful mediums through which we can raise our consciousness is through relationships. So I think as human beings, one of the fundamental elements of our existence is relationship. And so that's one of the biggest determinants in our quality of life. And so if we don't have secure, healthy, connected relationships, we really suffer. And so I think zeroing in on that really led me to do the work that I'm doing, which is restorative relationship work, where people are struggling in interpersonal conflict, wanting to help them change that into something that feels inherently scary or overwhelming and use it as a legitimate path towards personal growth, deeper intimacy, self-awareness. So yeah, it's very similar.
Kind of. So, wow, so we have some common ground. I love this. So, when I'm explaining sort of this to people, I try to, I try to stay away from the words consciousness because people don't really ask. But I guess just as a baseline here, what do we mean by elevating consciousness?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite criteria is for expanding our capacity for multiple and more complex perspectives. And so I think the more perspectives we can take, the more access we have to awareness of multifacets or the multidimensional aspects of the reality that we live in, right? And so I think as children, we're really grounded in more of a myopic, egocentric level of consciousness. And I think as we get older, it's not guaranteed, but we have the opportunity as humans to start expanding that perspective and really identifying with more and more facets of the lived reality that we're in.
And Jessica, I'll assume that your definition pretty much falls right in there, huh?
It does. Yeah. And it's even a very psychological definition that as adults, I mean, Dave just referenced childhood, but adults keep developing. There's a psychological developmental stages. And with each subsequent stage, there's more capacity. So for perspective, for understanding, for compassion, for relationality, for even just regulating your own nervous system. So it's like, yeah. So supporting ourselves and people and just pushing our development along so we do have more internal and external capacity.
Yeah, beautifully
kind of
said.
the best of what makes us human, right? Because as
Yeah.
humans, we're very interesting, right? and we can go to either side, right? So supporting what makes us the best of what is about being human.
Yeah, you guys are helping me kind of deepen my definition there, because I think it was something like, I'm seeing it through the lens of relationships now. Want to see like a broader picture to be able to, I don't know, connect more deeply, to sort of be able to, I can't help but my mind immediately goes to just like, the political climate, but just, I think one of the things I see is that we need to, as human beings, be able to be in the same room with somebody who we disagree with and have that be okay. Not have it be something that means that you're on that side of the room and I'm on this side of the room. And I think there's something inherent in here. So, before I get too far off track here, you guys have a new book, right? Which is called Transforming the Shame Triangle, From Shame to Love Using Parts Work. So to start, what's the shame triangle?
You want to go,
Yeah,
Dave,
so the
me?
shame triangle is a constellation of internal parts that we seem to all have. I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous, at least in the context of our work with clients. what we're seeing is, again, we're starting with an internal family systems, an IFS perspective, that human consciousness is multifaceted, that we have various parts of, right, ourselves, that it's not just one coherent total self that's acting across the board in all situations. We're recognizing from the IFS perspective that there are parts of us that become active in response to unique situations, unique relationships, and so forth. So one of the things that we're seeing is that there's 3 specific parts that seem to operate in a very unique constellation that cause a lot of challenges for people intrapersonally and interpersonally. And so in terms of relationships, it's relationship with self and relationship with other. And essentially what we're looking at are 3 distinct parts, one being the inner critic, the shame part that responds to the voice or the dictates or the sentences of the inner critic, and then escaper parts that respond to that interplay between shame and inner critic. So in this sense, we're saying that shame is not just a singular emotion or feeling or experience, but part of a constellation of parts that intermingle and make things more complex. And it's that intermingling, it's that intertwined tangliness of their interplay that make it so difficult often for people to suss out and recognize in their own inner experience. So that's a sort of a very high level, broad stroke there.
So I think my understanding of IFS is basically just to kind of put, because you defined it in your response there, but it's just kind of like there's different parts of us that are activated at different times that almost are like different characters, right? That show up in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's these, when you talk about a triangle, you're talking about 3 distinct parts that are sort of working together to create, like you said, certain complications there.
Correct.
So where does shame figure into this?
Yeah, well, shame is sort of at the root of it. Shame we're identifying or as the part, defining as the part that hears the voice of that inner critic and then feels that. It's a collapse part that then believes in first person all of the things the inner critic says, right? Or that others might say in the world, but really fundamentally says, I am broken, or I am not enough, or I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable. And it really has this deflated, defeatist story about the self, which is pretty intense. And honestly, it can be very dangerous for ourself as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think probably in like using the kind of common lexicon from the times we're in, it's that voice in your head, right? That
Right.
it maybe it might be a little deeper than that, but it shows up as this voice in your head, like, you're not smart enough to do that. And there's sort of a belief, right, that comes, it's sort of rooted in shame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And shame is usually a younger parts of ourself that had certain experiences, feelings, or proclivities about who we are, and they weren't fully allowed, or they were actively criticized by those around us. And so we learn very early on, like, oh, I've got to hide this. I've got to shut this down. If someone else sees this, I will be judged and fundamentally rejected. So it's really a social survival part that comes into play.
Yeah. This is something, it's funny because these concepts and things, I have 2 small boys who are 2, they're going to be 3 in April here. And I'm very conscious about, I do have twins. Yeah. And I'm very conscious about, I don't want, I went into this, with I was like, here's my parenting philosophy. I'm going to create the space for them to be exactly who they are. Right. And it comes from this idea that I thought there were certain parts of me that I shouldn't share, or that people wouldn't appreciate, or whatnot. I find it's sort of difficult. I find myself sort of butting up again, and I'm not really asking for parenting advice. I'm just sort of bringing up a struggle that comes right up here, right?
Yeah.
It's like, how do I, without sort of causing shame, right? How do I tell them it's not okay to tear their favorite book apart into a million pieces, right?
Yeah.
And, without sort of having an impact that's going to have, deeper, long lasting effects. That's something I deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, another shared mission for David and I is we have a child together. We have an 11-year-old. We're co-parents in addition to co-authors. And so this has been so central to our parenting of, right, how do I guide and mentor this child to certain behaviors, like not tearing something up, but not fundamentally shaming who he is as a being. That attitude that we can have in that moment as parents, that whether we say what's wrong with you or not, it comes off that way. Like, what the hell's wrong with you? Versus like, right, hey, that's not how we treat books is very different.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that you said right at the end there, Jessica, is an important distinction that we're also using even with adult clients, right? Because I'm specialized in the field of conflict, right, resolution. And so one of the things we're trying to make a distinction between is characterization of a person's essential being versus behavior, the impact of behavior. We always
Right.
want to have a safe space to talk about the impacts of behavior. We're always impacting other people. That's inevitable as human beings. And sometimes we impact people in a way that's negative, even though we didn't intend to. And so we want to normalize impact, and we want to normalize the capacity to take accountability for impact, to validate the feelings that emerge from the impact of our behavior without then an internalized messaging that sort of by extension, because we've hurt or impacted somebody, now there's something wrong with us, or that some facet of our being is a problem. One of the distinctions I make in my work that's very explicit is the distinction between an adversarial paradigm or frame and a restorative paradigm or frame of reference. And one of the major consequences of the adversarial frame is that it turns our lived experience into a problem. What I think, what I feel, what I do. And that's interesting to apply that to living systems like human beings or human relationships. It works if you're talking about mechanical systems like refrigerators or appliances or software, right? Because what do you do with a problem? You try to fix it, you try to change it. And yet when it comes to an emotional experience or relational experience, you can't fix a relational experience, but you can acknowledge the impact of behavior. So this nuance is really helpful for people to not internalize, right, that because they've impacted me, that now that means there's something wrong with them.
I love the way that you talked about impact there. It's like normalizing impact, because really that comes down to it. It's like you're concerned about the impact you're going to have, right? And sort of that concern, right? What you do with that concern, how you manage sort of the shame, if you will, it has an impact as well. So normalizing impact seems like it's a really obvious sort of idea, right? But you're going to have an impact either way, whether you sort of, withdraw and like hold this part of you back or you share it. So what kind of impact do you want to have? And it sort of almost gives you a sense of agency.
Absolutely. And that's the key thing, is we're trying to develop a sense of agency when it comes to conflict versus feeling subject to it or victim to it. Most people are feeling subject or victim to their reactions, their reactivity to conflict. Conflict is very overwhelming. We get dysregulated. When we get dysregulated, right, our center of consciousness changes from, right, some of the more advanced features or facets of the human brain into more primitive, where we become more reactive. We go into fight or flight survival responses or collapse responses. When you're in those lower or older parts of the brain, you have way less choice, exponentially less choice. And that's where things become really sticky and problematic, and we start having even more impact. And so it's not about trying to avoid having impact. It's about how do we manage the impact once it's happened.
Yeah. And just a key point I'm sorry, Jessica, just a key point that I heard there was that, if you get into that reactive state, right, there's far less choice there, which is going to have a huge impact on agency. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's exactly it. So for us, what we are seeing is the shame triangle parts. When we're stuck in those, we're not in agency. We're in our old survival strategies. Even if they came, about for very good reason, people are not really, you're more in your survival strategy than being authentic.
Yeah.
So we see this work as really like an important threshold to pass through. That until you really address your inner critic and your shame and all the ways you might escape through perfectionism or pleasing or avoiding or criticizing others, you're not really living and expressing yourself authentically.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting because I think that this is probably, well, I guess let me start with this. Like, who is this book? Who is it intended for when you guys sort of, the incitement of it came along?
Yeah, I think initially it was really a response primarily to the work that we do with clients. And what we're seeing over and over again is, wow, this is a place where so many people are getting stuck, right? People are getting pretty far. People who've done a lot of work. People who are relatively self-aware already. People that really are, along in their interpersonal or intrapersonal journey of self-discovery and self-growth. And yet it feels like there's this sticking point where people are getting mired in what feel like intractable dynamics with themselves or other people. And so what we started to recognize was, wow, shame is really at the heart of so much of this. And if this doesn't get talked about and addressed, people don't progress. And when we start to address it in this way that feels accessible, systematic, practical, and then, right, allowing more choice and agency, we start to see these really profound transformations. So initially, it's a response to the work that we're doing with clients. Now, right, in retrospect, we can say it's for a really wide audience of people that are recognizing on some level that shame is an issue for them.
I think what comes to mind is just my own experience. And of course, I have a background in psychology just out of interest, sort of always had a therapist or counselor. And when I got into coaching, I remember my first coaching session. For me, that went deeper. That was sort of my access. And I remember I was like, yeah, I want to be more productive. My coach was like, great. What's that going to do for you? And I was like, well, I'll be able to get, more stuff done. He's like, okay. And so let's say Ryan gets all the stuff done or more than you do now. What's that mean? I'm like, well, it became circular. And he's like, my question is like, what do you need to do? And basically it identified the problem right away. And I felt like it was like, I am equating my self-worth with productivity. Right. Yeah. And we got deeper down in there and I found and I remember reading the definition of shame. Like it hit me then. I was like, oh, you're sort of embarrassed about who you feel you authentically are or whatnot. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I am. And then he was like, well, what if it's not that? What if your worth is like based on something other than just, and I was confused and it sort of just kind of took my world and shook it up a little bit. But I think one of the things that I didn't realize before then is that the shame was there. And so right. I think one of the interesting things is that, how does one become aware of what they might have shame about?
It's a great question. What I see with clients is like each of these parts is one or two might be more prominent than the others. So some people, shame just feels like the primary thing they're aware of. It's all over the place for them. They feel embarrassed about who they are. They want to hide. They're worried about being rejected. And it's the most dominant. Then I think what you're describing is when like shame, it's there, but it's more invisible. And you're actually more in touch with the escaper parts, which are like, let me overachieve, let me overfunction, let me do great in the world so I don't feel bad about myself. So I think you're touching on it. The way to see it too is like, how do we have our sense of worth and value? Do we think it's something we have to work hard at, improve, and constantly be efforting at? Or is it something that is inherent to us? Or just the sense of being versus doing?
Yeah. And I know even with the clients I've worked with, and it just, the way I look at coaching is definitely like the ICF model, right? So I'm sort of guiding them through there. And we'll get to a point where I'll ask them, what if you just inherently had worth, and it was like inherently, and like that, I just see like their eyes blow out of their head. Like, number one, is that possible? And number two, that just like, they have that experience that I had, right? It was like being shaken up. And so, I wonder, the question that's on my mind right now is, if we say sort of, I've admitted I've got things that I feel shame about. Is it possible to sort of dissolve that shame? Is it possible to sort of, get rid of it?
Yeah, it's definitely not the goal. The goal is not to get rid of any part of our experience, right? So things that are challenging or difficult, overwhelming, that create fear, resistance in us, we're not trying to get rid of those parts or facets of our experience. We're trying to really understand them in the same way that if we're sitting on the other side of someone else, right? We're saying, I'm not just trying to get rid of you or eliminate your perspective. We know that that's not going to resolve conflict. It's the same thing with parts of us. Parts function like other people. And it's almost like we're in a dialogue with another human being in moments where that part is just wanting to be understood. And so often what we get is we get a real disarmament, a real regulated experience, a real sort of settling of parts, reactive flaring up when we're able to really listen. Like, what is it that you're trying to tell me? Because all these parts have really important information. So if we go back to that distinction I made earlier between the adversarial and the restorative paradigm or mind frame, right? The adversarial is saying what you're experiencing right now is a problem. So if we look at shame, then we say it's a problem. We need to fix it, resolve it, make it different. If you go to the restorative, the underlying intention is to understand. So we see everything that comes up in us as information, and all information is valuable on some level. right? So these parts, even like the inner critic, even though its strategy is detrimental and impactful on us in a way that's negative, it's actually trying to tell us something about something that's important that we hold dear. So let's say an inner critic is trying to shame you for being late to an event. And the way that it's doing, God, you're always late. You're always fucking this up. Whatever it says. What it's trying to show you implicitly is that punctuality, maybe relationships, showing respect to other people, professionalism, all these things are important to you. But the way that it describes it or is explaining it is very harmful in terms of the impact on your sense of self. So we want to understand, what are you trying to tell me, inner critic? What are you trying to tell me, shame? That's important, right? What are these values that we're holding dear that you're trying to protect or advocate for?
Yeah, I think I love that you said that. You're like, we're not trying to get rid of anything because, I'm so glad because that was kind of what's coming up in my experience now. But I love that you said it becomes informational, because I think the reason, and I guess this is my question for you both, is I can see now the reason why these things might be invisible, your shame might be invisible, is because you would naturally avoid that if it's not just informational.
Right. Who wants to feel shame about themselves? Right.
Not I. Yeah.
Right. Let's get out of here.
And so, wow. So like, if you just stop avoiding it and you start thinking like, what is it that this is trying to tell me? Like, I think there's a lot of information there that's just below that surface. You just have to, I don't know, is it a process of sort of accepting the emotion, or is that why we as coaches or as therapists might say, just kind of sit in emotion? Is that part of what that direction is intended for?
That is a part of it. It's not about getting rid of, but one piece is it is about healing it and unburdening it. Both us, we use this work ourselves, and it's like, oh, I'm holding a lot less shame in my system and in my body than before I was doing this work. And when shame does show up, it's not about it never showing up. I know what to do with it now. I know how to go, okay, don't tell this shitty shame story about myself or the situation. Go deeper and hold the feelings that are coming up. Be aware of the beliefs that are showing up, the values that are underneath all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part
so
of
a lot
that,
of it. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but part of you just getting me excited to piggyback on what you're saying. Part of what we're having to reframe is that safety, emotional safety, is not the same as emotional comfort. And so I think in an adversarial paradigm, we associate any emotional discomfort as not safe or, again, problematic. Whereas in the restorative paradigm, we're normalizing discomfort as, again, the signal that we're receiving information. And so we're saying that emotional discomfort is actually something to be curious about versus something that's threatening and just automatically to be rejected and shifted. So we're trying to create new windows of tolerance literally for our nervous system, right? How long can I sit in the presence of uncomfortable feelings without collapsing into shame or jumping right into an escaper strategy?
Yeah. I think one of the other times in sessions where I had sort of my mind blown is where, I had a coach tell me, what if discomfort's okay?
Right.
In this situation, and I'm like, again, I felt agency then, right? It was like, oh, then I have a choice. If I choose to go into that, I can choose to not go into it. And that changes the relationship, right? And that's sort of what I hear you saying here.
100%.
Exactly.
So I want to share an experience and just see how it lines up with sort of what you're saying here, because I haven't even got to any of my questions yet that I have here. I'm just sort of knowing off the top of my head here, which I love. I want to take advantage of this situation. And I had this experience where, when I was a kid, I had this, my dad, I had 5 little brothers, right? So there was very, very little attention to go around, and my parents, they just, they're very busy people. And so I had the opportunity to go with my dad on a boating trip with his friends. And I remember I had this feeling of like being, one with the guys. And then he started saying things that sort of excluded me from the group, sort of like teasing me. It made me feel like excluded. One of them, I used to have like freckles, like real bad. And he was like, oh yeah, well, freckle-faced strawberry over there is and I remember I just like shut down. And so I didn't realize this till years later. I don't know if it impacted me then, but I had this experience and I was talking to a partner, a significant other I had at the time. And I was like, I realized that I literally think about this every day. And I sort of like obsess over the way I look at things. And she said to me, she's like, well, you should just tell him. And I was like, well, I don't want to tell him. I mean, I don't want him to feel guilty, and all these things come up, right? So I don't remember what happened. My dad ends up coming down and I tell him this. And the impact, it sort of went like, yeah, so you said this thing. And he's like, I don't remember that. He's like, I was 27 years old or something. And I got 6 kids and I'm like, how am I going to buy groceries next week? And I was with my friend and he tells me all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't know. It was recommended to me that I tell you. And nothing really happened then, but something started changing. The fact that I just sort of, shared it, right? There's something about the connection until that thought doesn't have the same impact on me anymore. Mm-hmm. How does that, what happened there?
I want to keep it balanced.
Well, I first want to map it out, right? Of like, this is such a great example. It's on the surface, such a small moment. It's funny. I actually was called freckle face at 8 years old too, and it had a big impact on me. So I'm like, this is funny that it's a shared experience or coincidental. But right, you were externally criticized and you felt the shame of like, embarrassed about who you are, probably didn't even have much self-consciousness about your freckles or awareness. And now you have that and you felt excluded, right? So there's the shame piece. Yeah. And then what I'm guessing is as you got older, there was also now an inner critic that was like sounding like your dad on some level, saying, look at this about you, look at that about you. And then there was probably escapers that are like, well, I'm going to overexercise, or I'm going to do this so I look good, or I'm going to overcompensate, in this, I'll be really smart. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if I don't look, right? Yeah. Yeah. So then you have this triangle that's all like stemmed and created from just that one moment. Yeah. 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 So I think just what you did by just bringing it to light with your dad, even though he didn't have probably the ideal response, is sort of you broke your own triangle in that moment of speaking up for yourself. And even just saying that didn't feel good. Yeah, it's one of those things where, it's like I'm in the experience and maybe I still am. But like I said, I remember thinking sort of almost regretfully, why did I say that? Because it didn't even do anything. And but it did. But it did for you.
It started losing its power. It was like, it was like there wasn't, it was like, well, obviously it's not true.
Right. Well, that's an important point right there is my suspicion is that it feels good to make a choice. Like regardless of, ideally, he responds with validation and acknowledgement. But even when he doesn't, what you're doing is you're stepping out of a victim role in terms of the relationship to the inner critic, right? And you're recognizing this isn't mine. This isn't my voice anymore. This actually came from somewhere outside of me. Exactly. Got internalized, and now I'm sending it back. I'm rejecting it as mine, right? And so I think this is something that's really important that we talk about in the book is trying to really locate the origins of our shame stories, locate the origins of our inner critic voices, right? And almost in the overwhelming majority of cases, you'll find that this is something that comes from outside of you, whether it's family, friends, society, right? These are not messages that are inherent to our own individual consciousness. These are things that we've internalized. And through the internalization, we forget that this is something that was given to us or inflicted upon us against our will, against our awareness. And so that recognition where you start to, this is one of the biggest turning points for a lot of clients. Like, oh, this really harsh inner critic voice that's been brutalizing me and limiting my potential for so long is not even my voice. It's not my truth. To recognize that and to start externalizing again, right, and putting it back where it belongs is very liberating for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think, I sort of had a troubled relationship with my dad when I was a kid. I don't know what, we're fine now, but something along the lines of these things that I discovered is that some of the voices or whatever that I even thought were like my dad's, they weren't, like I have these like sort of memories that are similar, but the context is like very emotionally heavy, right? I think it's sort of compensated in the character, if you will, right? The emotionality of it. And on one hand, it was sort of like, wow, I just made that up. And I sort of, that, on the other hand, it was like, this voice serves no purpose. And it just, you know what I mean? It just sort of, it loses its power. Like you said, I don't think it goes anywhere, but it's kind of like, it speaks up and like, it's you. How are you? Like kind of really using the IFS here is kind of like these conversations that you have with yourself. So it very much is interesting. But I think about the impact of that on my life is that it was very real in my experience, right? And to be able to have worked that out earlier, it could have just really changed some things in my life, right? Could have made things just a little bit less stressful or whatnot.
Yeah.
So the book description talks about the inner critic, shame, and the escaper, and they're players in sort of this internalized drama. So I don't know, break down each one. How do they play a role here? What is it? You mentioned the escaper, right? And that's, you characterize that a little bit, but maybe walk me through with these characters and what roles they play.
Yeah. So,
go ahead.
You good. So I think, people have heard so far, you have a clear sense of there's an inner critic. That's the voice that speaks usually in second person. What's wrong with you? How could you? It's kind of this internalized bully or the villain, so to speak, that's shaming. And then the part that we're calling shame is the part that hears those criticisms and judgments and really feels them and collapses and absorbs it. And in first person says, I'm wrong or I'm not okay, whatever the takeaway is there. So just those two parts are pretty intense. It's like enough, right?
Yeah, right.
And then we have usually several escapers that jump into action. Because the escapers are trying to not hear the inner critic and not feel the shame, basically. So one level is the overfunctioning escapers. I'm going to be better, get smarter, achieve more, outperform and prove my inner critic or the world that I'm worthy, right? And then I won't feel shame. And that works temporarily.
Yeah.
But eventually it doesn't work and we mess up a little bit, or even if we're doing great, we don't think we are, and the inner critic will get reactivated. Then there's underfunctioning escapers. I'm just going to zone out. I'm going to overeat or overscroll or overfocus on something else. I'm going to do drugs, right? To let me avoid and space out and zone out so I don't have to hear this voice and I don't have to feel much. Yeah. Sometimes too, we have ones that certain feelings are better than shame. So anxiety and depression are actually usually escapers. It can be relatively, this is in air quotes, easier to feel anxiety than to actually feel shame.
Yeah.
Or to feel anger about things. So we can have these escapers that are really stuck just in certain feelings and emotions and want to stay there. And then we have aggressive escapers. I'm going to criticize and be aggressive to you and focus on you so that I don't have to feel it myself, or aggressive to self, where that's more like the more severe self-harm or, risky behaviors.
Yeah.
And we can have multiple escapers. They can jump back and forth. One strategy works for a night and then it flips into another the next day, or we have one strategy of an escaper in this environment and then we have a different one with somebody else or at home.
One of the things that shows up for me as I'm listening to you talk about this, I mean, it is and I was like, wow, I can relate to all three of those escapers, right? I mean, all three of them. And, I think one of the things that shows up for me is that, and this is sort of related, I'm sharing my experience just because I think it's a good to help, a real world experience. And it just gives some elements to work within here for analogy's sake. But I think that one of the things I see here is that when you do, there's sort of the model, right? And then there's the human experience, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder, you want to make sure that you value your client's experience, right? Not just say, oh, you know what? Here's this model. Here, let's plug all the parts in. You see what's happening here, right? How do you reconcile? How does that dance happen when you're working with clients, right? And there's this model that explains something, but their reality is different than that simple, elegant way of explaining.
I love that question. And that's a really, really important question. And it's actually something that's at the root of some of the philosophical tenets or principles that really drive my work. In distinction to Jessica, I'm not a therapist. I'm a process facilitator. And so I'm able to do things differently because I'm not bound by the same sort of criteria. And so one of the things that's really informed, so that means I've had to be more explicit in my own journey to create my own criteria for guiding people's process. One of the things that I really like is narrative therapy and theory, which really talks about taking the professional out of the expert role and putting the client in the expert role in terms of the expert in their own experience. And that's something that when I encountered that idea, was so profound to me, because it was something I had experienced a lot of harm as a client at the hands of professionals. And so when I saw this change of position in terms of who really had the agency and who had the power, I was really excited by that because it felt revolutionary. And so for me, there's a lot of care, there's a lot of intentionality in not trying to superimpose models onto other people's experience. And so if people are describing something that sounds like fits the model, then what we're saying is, here's a model, does it resonate?
Yeah.
If this resonates and feels like it's helping organizing your experience, if it feels like it's giving you a tool that's accurate and reflective of your lived experience, great, let's work it together. And I'll show you how people do that. If it doesn't, let's look at a different tool. It's similar to a categorical system like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs, these personality typology systems. If I go around saying, you're a 5, I know what 5s are, and these are your limits, and this is what you're a 5 and you're never going to be anything but a 5. Like, I'm not helping anybody. But if I say, oh wow, when you talk about struggling with this way, I recognize that this fits in a pattern of a model of a system that I like, and it says these things about healthy behaviors and unhealthy behaviors, do they resonate? And I choose for myself, that's way different. So I'm offering tools and seeing if they resonate or not.
Yeah. So Jessica, I have to ask, but what about on the therapeutic side, right? As a therapist,
right?
What is that dance like?
Yeah. So sometimes people are coming in more with like, I have this procrastination problem, or I'm always people pleasing, right? Which I'm going, oh, that's escapers. So even if I don't use the language with them, I know, okay, well, that's one part, and that's what you're identifying as your problem. And if I just focus on that, we'll get some traction. But then if I don't bring in these other parts, there isn't the transformation. So that's when I might say, tell me if this is helpful. Let's draw out this triangle. Like, okay, there's procrastination. It sounds like there's also this critical voice.
Yeah.
So far it's been 10 out of 10. People go, yeah, that's what's happening. It actually helps them understand what feels so messy inside. It gives some clarity, and that in itself is helpful. But I'll give another example. Last night, I have a client that we've done tons of parts work, but now she's reading the book. And so she came to me saying, I want to talk about my achievement shame triangle. It's kind of similar to what you were talking about, where she's like, my value only comes from always being productive and having this certain kind of work that I'm having. And so we spent about 15 minutes having fun, map out the triangle. What's that inner critic like? What's specifically the beliefs of that shame? And what are the escapers? But then I say to her, I don't tell her, I ask, okay, tune in. Which of those parts needs the attention right now? And she chose shame. And so then we spent the rest of the time really doing deeper work of talking to the shame, caring for it, acknowledging it. And then we identified it's holding certain burdens. So next week, we're going to unburden those for the shame.
Yeah.
And then maybe the week after, we'll look at some of the escapers or something. But I'm letting her guide where we go with it within this framework.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll say, just to piggyback, is that when you're doing IFS work, you're really wanting to make sure that you're getting consent all along from all the facets of yourself. So you're never imposing facets or parts of the sequence onto parts. So people are being coached to really develop this ethic, this protocol of consent, and making sure there's genuine alignment with these parts, so that you're not just superimposing interventions that actually aren't in alignment with a person's felt sense of their own reality.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a huge part of it. And I think that is, well, I can't help but harken back to, you said that you'd had some not so great experiences with therapists, right? And it probably came from, I don't know, I'm making an assumption. I don't want to speak for you, David, but it probably is related to consent in there somewhere about, hey, what do you think about going down this road?
100%. And I would, to be honest, over 70% of my clients come to me saying, we're looking for someone who's not a therapist. We want something different. And that's not to bash therapy or to say that therapists are inherently a problem. But I think there is something about the structure and the power dynamic that's not explicit enough yet. It's starting to change. I think people are becoming more and more aware of it as people are learning how to name their bias right? And name their frameworks with more awareness and just being more honest about the relativity of their own perspectives as professionals, right? And that we all have limitations and we need to name those. But I think, a lot of people have come harmed by that superimposition of, well, this is what's going on. It's too prescriptive for a lot of people, right? People want to have their experience validated. They want to speak in their own terminology. They want to feel like they're really driving the process for themselves, right? It's agency led. Whereas if the therapist is saying, this is what it is, and if you don't agree with my prognosis, you really shut down something that could be transformative for people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't help but think of, so we're talking about like framework sort of. And David, I hear you saying sort of you might tell somebody about a framework and be like, I don't know, does this resonate? Whereas Jessica, there's a similar approach. It's sort of related, but it's not really important that they know the framework unless they sort of discover it on their own or start putting things together, right? So it's a little bit.
Yeah, it really depends on the person. Like some people love the framework. They maybe are more like the intellectual part of it.
Yeah.
And it actually supports them. Some people, they just need the experience of feeling different within themselves and they don't need the framework as much. And it's like, great, whichever road, right? And I think that's the flexibility Dave and I are talking about is like, we're meeting the client where they are and yet offering them a way to move beyond where they are as well. Because ultimately that's what everyone's coming in coach or therapy for is I want to be in a different place than I am.
I think that, I had I have a degree in psychology and I always knew sort of what ADHD was. And then I was really having a hard time at work, like when I was like 39. And I heard a podcast and it was talking about low testosterone, it happens when you're like 39. So I call my doctor. I'm like, I got low testosterone. She's like, why do you say that? So, I tell her this and she's like, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you go to a psychiatrist first? And I'm like, what? Psychiatrist? So I go and I talk to this woman and she's like, well, she's like, I think, I could formally make a diagnosis for ADHD. And I was like, okay, I'm finding another, I just was like, that's not, I know what that is. I kind of felt like that at first. Yeah. And I knew what it was and I never put that, if you will, that structure, that model on myself. And then once I did, I started being like, oh my gosh, like, it was like almost like something I was avoiding and it still is, so then like, I was like, well, maybe I'll join a community on social media. And they all, like everything out there is kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of self-deprecating in a way. I would need to work with this, and so for me, that's something I still like struggle with because I'll see something and then be like, oh my gosh, that is true. And so I'm not sure that, having I guess I went to the doctor and said, hey, diagnose me. What's going on here? And I sort of asked for it, but the diagnosis has been sort of the least helpful part about the whole thing in a way.
Is it helpful at all to have the diagnosis?
It definitely has. Yes, it is helpful. But, I want to be clear about that. It's just there's certain parts of it that are difficult, right? Where
what's difficult about it?
Like, I will, if I see the trope of like, I'll just bring something at home. My partner, Micah will be like, she's made the joke before. She's like, okay, tell me you have a neuroatypical partner without telling me you have a neuroatypical partner. And like, I like turn around like, what do you mean? And like the spice drawer is open and the cabinet drawer is open. I've got something on the stove and they're both still. And I was like, well, I was going to put this in there. And I'm like, explaining to her and like stuff like that is like what we're talking about. It almost is like there is some shame there, like about, I guess I do things differently than you would like almost. Right. And so I never attributed that to myself before,
Yeah.
Maybe it helped with awareness and maybe that's what I'm speaking to, but it definitely, sometimes I will do things that are just sort of out of my control. And I'll be like, and then I remember I told people, I was like, I went to the doctor and they're saying I have ADHD and they're like, are you serious? You didn't? And I'm like, wait, what? What's going on, everybody?
Everyone knew this but me.
Yeah, I had that experience. And I just sort of thought some of those things are still a little bit difficult, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it just is, it certainly has helped me. There's certain, I have like a framework to look for things with and be like, oh, I'll try this strategy or whatnot, or to understand really why you might procrastinate. You know what I mean? Is having ADHD. That's been helpful, but some of it still is sort of it's a frustrating thing you're always trying to learn about, I guess. I don't know if you're able
Yeah.
to get what I'm saying here.
There's two things I want to say. And one is like the power of labels. And ideally, a label is liberating, not limiting. But a lot of the times we get a label or a diagnosis and it's pathologizing. And the people around us essentialize us into that this is all of who you are and all of who you're going to be. That's limiting. It's actually damaging. Right? Versus we can get a label and the liberation would be, wow, this puts everything into context. Now a lot makes sense that felt previously disconnected or, not making sense. And now there's actually a path forward to address it, to manage it, to live with it, to accept myself.
Yeah.
So I think there's that piece, which is hard with labels, like a diagnosis.
My experience, and that's what I tried to share there, is my experience is definitely both those things. It's definitely like shed some light on some things, and it's made some things difficult. I guess, what I'm saying, speaking to what we were talking about earlier, is that it's it's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to think, oh, this is because of this, that's happening. And it just comes down to sort of acceptance, I guess.
Yeah.
But also highlights a distinction we were making earlier between identity and your sense of identity and sense of self versus behavior and impact. And so I have a ton of clients that identify as ADHD or ADD. And it's really interesting because they're coming to me with relational issues where they're functioning cognitively differently. So they're behaving very differently. And so if a partner has taken on that label or projected it onto a partner and then using sort of the weight of dominant narratives, right? Like neurotypical narratives, like, you're the different one. You're the one that's doing things counter to what's normal. You really start to see a lot of erosion of trust and safety because it's starting to bleed into the behavior, starting to create a sense of who you are as a person. It's becoming more of an identity. And if a person starts to take that identity on and internalize that, then I think we start to see parts that are holding shame around it. And it starts to bleed together, where it's been really helpful for me to have partners identify what are the behaviors that have an impact that are different from your preferences, and to talk about, and explore what are the capacities for change around those behaviors. What if those things can't change functionally? Can they be felt differently, looked at, interpreted differently? Sometimes that's the key to really changing things, feeling different in terms of people feeling seen and heard in the relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you both this question, and I wonder, what individually, and Jessica, we could start with you. What led you to this work? Was there something, what lived experience kind of led you to what you've ultimately, we've had this book out that came out in October, and curious about that.
Yeah, I was working with clients, whether it was individuals or couples, and, they're all trying to solve something, trying to sort through something, figure something out, right? Work through stuff. And whenever I'd get curious about what is that, I started to see, oh, there's this part and then there's that part, and we'd work on that part, but then there'd be this other thing that pops up, and it was like this whack-a-mole experience of like, what is this inner tangle that I keep hitting up against within people, and they're hitting up against it themselves. And there was really this aha moment where I loved the drama triangle, and I would teach the drama triangle about interpersonal conflict. And it was in a session with someone where I was like, this is the internalized drama triangle. That there's multiple voice parts that are deeply connected and intertwined with each other, but it's not an actual inner tangle. It's something that is like this inner constellation that we can make sense of. Yeah. So it was really through just like kind of being in the grapple with clients of trying to help them sort through themselves and their relationships. And then once I started to see it in this way, I was like, I couldn't unsee it. And then I would approach it, whether I would bring the model or just do the model. And the work would just be so much more efficient and effective, like light, speed. It just, within several sessions, people are feeling shifts versus several months, let's say, let alone years.
So Jessica, what drove you towards the work to being a therapy that led to that?
Yeah, it was actually, hopefully this isn't too tangential, but it was actually research I was doing in Rwanda. I was in a conflict resolution master's program, and I was doing research in Rwanda on the genocide that happened there in 1994. And I was researching people who rescued during the genocide as well as people who killed during the genocide. And there was this distinct difference of the people that rescued and saved lives, even though they were told they could be killed for rescuing and saving, like they really risked themselves for this.
Yeah.
They all had attachment figures that they described. I wasn't asking. I just said, why would you save someone's life? And they would tell me stories of their parents or their grandparents that modeled this pro-social behavior for them, and that they had a positive attachment figure in their life. And then I went into the prisons and I'm asking these people who killed, why did you kill? And they said because they were terrified of the propaganda. They believed the propaganda, whereas the other people could see through the propaganda. And I asked them, did you have a parent who ever told you not to do this, or a role model? And their story was they didn't have attachment figures. So I'm getting to one of the most bigger human atrocities of genocide, and it's whittling down to, do you have love and attachment figures in your life? And so that was like, it brought me back to doing more of this inner and interpersonal work of like, that's where I want to actually work with people, is building those connections within themselves and with their loved ones.
Wow, what a beautiful story. You would never think that, that might lead you there, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I didn't
really,
think that's where I thought I'd be, in some international NGO doing conflict transformation, which would have been amazing. I didn't think it would actually bring me to do therapy work.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that not tangential at all. I think things make a lot of sense when it comes from that place. I mean, just your curiosity of being like, okay, wait a second here. Well, what if that's true for you guys? Why did people make this different choice, right?
Yeah.
And I do think it is, we're sort of talking about voices in our heads in a way, right? But not only, we're past the part where that might be funny. It's like, hey, listen, this is something that we have. This is something that's actually going on here. And this is its impact on the world in mass.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing that, Jessica.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
And David, what about for you? What led you to, it isn't interesting. I don't know that before I met you, I've heard of your process facilitator. I don't know that I've heard that title before. But what led you to this?
I grew up the son of two ministers who were really steeped in social justice. They really saw Jesus' ministry as kind of a social radical who was really about teaching social equality regardless of where people are from, right? And what their stature, status in life is, just a real social justice martyr. My parents took that really, really seriously, for better or for worse. And so it was something that I was raised in, but I never identified with the Christianity part of it. But I did internalize as some of my identity that sense of being on the right side of social justice. And that usually meant, right, working for creating a space where marginalized voices have a place to be heard. So that was something that really stuck for whatever reason. My psychology just had the receptor sites, right, to receive that information and internalize it and take it on as my own. And so that led me ultimately, it's a long, windy road, but I ultimately ended up in the field of restorative justice. And so in similar scale or scope, I started out working at the institutional level like Jessica. It was this intention, I'm going to change the system, right, through this work. And then getting really disillusioned by the complexity and what felt like the intractability of these things. And I wanted to make a different impact. I wanted to really feel it in a very personal way. And I had a sense that the protocols that were sort of in place through the institutional settings were hampering the kind of intimacy I could get and thereby the kind of transformation I could get with people. So I realized, well, this is a really cool model. And in conversations with Jessica, we were brainstorming, how could this restorative model be applied to very intimate relationships? And so we was like, oh, wow, I don't think anyone's doing this that we know about. And so we created this model together, really, the restorative relationship conversations model, which now I'm the person really holding. Spearheading and holding and evolving. But it's something now that it's so effective and so compelling. It brings so many people to my doorstep. People hear that word restorative and there's something intuitive about that. And it's intuitive in the sense that right? Restorative is about repairing relationships. So it's so humanizing. It's humanizing conflict. It's inviting people to take accountability, right? And that's what we're seeing on the world stages. Now we're having more and more leaders do everything they can to sidestep taking accountability for the impact they're having. And people see, like, this is not the world we want to live in. This is not the way we want to be, right? So this restorative ethos, I think, is so powerful. And we all want our relationships, our attachment-based relationships, to feel harmonious, because when they don't, we suffer. And so I think we're waking up to really one of the most important things that determines the quality of our life as human beings, are our relationships. How can we do that differently? But we're not trained to do that. We're not socialized to manage relationships in a way that keep us safe and connected.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a tragedy. So I want to do something about that. And this is my way of doing something different.
Yeah, I had a psychologist on here. What is his book? He just wrote Super Psyched. It came out last year, and it's about connection. Dr. Adam Dorsey, and we just talked about. It occurred to me. I was like, man, what does it mean that we're wired for connection? What is? And that is another one of those things that it's one thing to understand the framework, and it's a different thing experientially, right?
That's right.
And what I sort of see in what you just said there, David, is that there's kind of like you're really involved in sort of creating this space for the experiential portion of, the reason why we need to connect, right? It's almost like, the analogy is terrible, but it's like why we need to breathe, and you're just creating the space so people can experience that.
Yeah, I think the way I would frame it is, based on that title of the book, is we're wired for connection, but we're socialized for disconnection and conflict. That's the problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that is something that is, I think we all experience the sort of dissonance there in a strange and different way. And it sort of
absolutely
shows up in different ways. And I think probably you could point to several areas in our culture. It could be the leaders, right? Where this is showing up, how that makes sense to us, that, certain leaders make certain decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when someone says something like, I know this isn't true, but it feels true, what's going on in their nervous system when that's happening?
That's a great question. I would say it's different parts of them that are actually polarized. So there's a part that might know it's not true on a certain level, or can hold a perspective of what is true, let's say. And then there's most likely a younger or hurting or wounded part that is interpreting it in a certain way. And so it doesn't feel good. So I would want to explore, let's look at those different parts. And really what matters is what's going on with the part that feels it that way. And usually it needs to be updated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so does that exploration, because I didn't realize now I just said something, David is creating the space where this, but I mean, that's exactly that, pretty much that's what you're doing too, right? You're creating the space for them to explore that. And so it seems like that process, right, of awareness and acceptance is sort of what, I don't know how I would describe the outcome. Maybe it enhances their experience or their life or their understanding. I don't know. Maybe that's a question for you, Jessica.
Yeah. Like, are you asking that does the acceptance support them?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
That is a direct question, but it's like that process that you're describing, what does it do? What is effective about it? What is the effectiveness of it?
I think if we're talking about, especially with the shame triangle, and in the book, we really walk people through the transformation of these parts, and so that they actually are functioning differently. Basically, in the book, we do walk people through the transformation of all of these parts into what we call the self-love triangle. And so the inner critic transforms into an inner coach, which is the part that still holds us to healthy standards, but does so with encouragement instead of criticism. Our escapers, they become inner nurturers that instead of trying to avoid and run away through doing or zoning out or achieving or aggressing, it's like the inner nurturer turns towards and is like tending to whatever is going on. And then shame transforms not so much into another part as much as just being with our raw experience and not adding a shame storyline onto whatever our experience is. And so acceptance is a big part of this, of all of those parts, of whatever our experience is. And yeah, the experience of that is you will feel different within yourself. I mean, it really starts to push people's development along, actually, where they're moving from being in that socialized self, that developmental stage, into more of a self-authorship of being who I want to be and connecting to my own values and principles and rewriting those beliefs, or being in touch with my needs and building mutual interdependent relationships based on that and based on who I am and who you are fundamentally. Yeah. And so what we're seeing is people feel better. I mean, plain and simple, but Davis said it before, like, it's actually quite a radical notion to say, like, yeah, you can experience life without that inner critic berating at you all the time. Like, that is possible. We're not just saying this as a sales pitch. We've experienced it. Our clients are experiencing it. That, yeah, it is possible to feel different with all of those parts.
I think what stuck out to me there is just you talking about, the triangle of self-love, right? We were talking about how you transform the inner critic to the inner coach. I mean, you're not necessarily changing their function. Right. I mean, it's funny how powerful language is, in this. And my gosh, I could talk to you guys for like 6 hours about some of this stuff. But, I think that it almost serves the same function. Maybe it changes the way that you're receiving it in a way, right? If it's your inner coach.
Yeah.
And the outcome of that, like you said, is pretty radical transformation.
Yeah. It's still a protector part. Right. But its method of how it's going about doing that is very different. That is what shifts.
Yeah.
And then experientially, it feels much different internally.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something, Ryan, really key, which is the functions don't change. It's the strategies. And I like that word, the strategy, because that's a helpful way to help clients understand what it is about the way that an inner critic versus an inner coach do function, is they're employing very different strategies, right? And so it's similar in the interpersonal work that I'm doing with clients. I'm trying to help them describe to each other cleanly, right? What are your needs in terms of the attachment to feel safe and connected in the relationship? What is it that you're needing? And often people confuse strategy with the need, right? They say, well, I need you to stop talking to your friend on the phone every evening and pay more attention to me. And that's what I need. And they're saying it that way, but that's a strategy. They're imagining this strategy of behavior is going to make me feel different in the relationship, when there could be a different strategy to meet that same need of feeling important. The need is to feel important and special in the relationship. But people are confusing strategy with need, and it's similar with these parts, fusing function with strategy. And that's where I think people get stuck in these loops. Say, well, I've just got to get rid of this part. Going back to what we were saying before, I don't want to hear this voice. So it's not the voice, it's the voice of strategy. And we have to retrain this voice to have a new strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very powerfully put there, David. I understand you guys have a companion course that's going to start here pretty soon, along with the book. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Jess. Okay. It's an 8-week course that's coming out in February, and it's designed to help people really dive into this work. So people that are feeling called to do more of the shame triangle work in a much more immersive way, we're really wanting to make that accessible. So it's going to be 8 weeks, an hour and a half live session each week with supplemental recordings and material. So it's going to be just a really in-depth, deep dive to the shame triangle work for people that already see its value or have an interest in really getting into it that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It sounds phenomenal. And especially like you guys said, I'm not sure that anybody is really talking about this framework in this way, right? There's a unique, there's some unique things that get identified in here, and there's so much that we didn't get into here. So I thank you guys for allowing me to meander through my first dual interview here. You guys have been very kind.
I think the thing that I'm really wanting people to have a sense of and I want to pique some interest and plant some seeds around is the concept of self. We didn't talk much about that, and that's such a fundamental aspect of IFS work in general. But in terms of how to really manage the shame triangle differently, this is such a key piece. And it can be such a game changer for people once they start to really get a felt or embodied sense of what this is. Right? So what we're advocating for is that people, as a starting point and then kind of a North Star or compass in their work with parts, they have a sense of connection, embodied connection, not just an intellectual, conceptual idea of what self is, but really an embodied connection to self. That's where you are able to generate more stability, more coherence, a sense of this organized experience that feels safe and regulated, right? We're really wanting people to have a clear understanding of what self looks and feels like, and then how to utilize that in a practical way when leveraging parts work. And so for me, it's been such a profound thing to be able to deepen people's awareness of, because I think ultimately it's the self that's really driving some of these higher states of consciousness that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation. I think humanity's greatest hopes lie in more people connecting to and staying grounded in self-energy.
The final word here, please.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I echo that with self being so fundamental. And many people are doing their healing work from other parts of them that are actually just trying to manage the self-development or the healing or the achievement.
Yeah.
And that's part of why it doesn't really last or stick and hold. But when self is doing the healing with parts, that's where we really have a lasting transformation. But the other piece I would emphasize too that we didn't get into is, we did talk about the way that the shame triangle is internalized from the drama triangle or from like your experience with your dad calling you freckle face.
Yeah.
But it's also internalized from larger social structures, power structures, the isms. Like these are ways that we're hit against the world and learn, oh, in the world, this version of me or this part of me or the way that I look is not accepted and allowed. So it might not happen through home. Also, the shame triangle can be inherited as a legacy burden. So it might not be something we specifically went through in our kind of biography, but something that has been passed down through the generations, where you see, oh, there's a family trend here of everyone had this weird freak accident, or all the women act in this way, or everyone's struggling with this kind of same money issue. How interesting. And so sometimes the parts work level needs to go a bit further with legacy unburdening. Yeah.
Jessica, where can people get more information on the book and the course?
Yeah. Well, my website, jessicafern.com. Dave's website is Restorative Relationship Conversation or Stations. Is that plural?
Yeah, the actual website itself is just Restorative Relationship, but the model is called Restorative Relationship Conversations.
And people can see our book and our upcoming course on those sites, but the Azurite Way is where the course will be hosted. So that's a third website that people can go to and see this course and then future courses.
Yeah,
Awesome.
And that's a platform that we're building together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been just such a rich conversation for me, and there's so much that can be kind of seen, and just there's so much power and agency that can be given to this framework. I just see the potential just in our conversation today. So I thank you guys for the work and for sharing the afternoon with me today. And I really wish you the best.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversational style, just diving in, and the authenticity of your shared experiences with us. That feels really meaningful for me as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.